Imagine you drive 14 hours straight. You've got a deed in your hand, still warm from the notary stamp. You've spent $187,000 and 8 months of your life building toward this moment. And then, 200 meters from your front door, you hear it. A high-pitched drill, metallic and sharp, cutting through the morning fog. You get out of the truck. And there she is. A woman you have never seen in your life, crouched at the front door of your property, calmly swapping out the lock like she owns the place. She turns around. No flinch, no embarrassment, just a smile that had been rehearsed 100 times before. "I'm protecting community heritage," she says. "And who exactly are you?" I'm going to tell you the full story of what happened next, and how it ended in a room full of 200 people, with 4 federal agents walking through the back door. Stay with me. My name is Scott Collins. I'm based in Denver. I'm not a developer, not a resort tycoon, not the villain of anyone's story. I'm someone who spent years saving carefully and planning deliberately toward a single goal, a 3-bedroom log cabin on 12 acres in Clearwater County, Montana, called Forest Ridge Lodge. The plan was straightforward: renovate it, run it as a weekend rental, retire there within 5 years. I had done everything right. I had the deed, I had title insurance, I had inspection reports, survey maps, and county recording confirmation. This was supposed to be the quiet beginning of something I had built from scratch. Then came the drill. The woman at my door had a laminated ID clipped to her jacket. Her name was Deborah Caldwell. Her title read, Clearwater Regional Natural Heritage Coordinator. I would later confirm that title existed nowhere in any government registry, any official payroll, or any state-recognized organization. She had given herself that name and manufactured that authority entirely from thin air. She told me there was an active ecological assessment underway, and that no unauthorized access was permitted during the review period. She told me I'd need to speak with the Clearwater Conservation Committee before I could enter my own property. I held up the deed. She glanced at it with the mild disinterest of someone who had already decided it didn't matter. I called 911. It took 40 minutes for anyone to arrive. Sergeant Dale Pruitt pulled up and walked toward Deborah like he was approaching a neighbor at a barbecue. Shoulders loose, voice soft, the professional distance of law enforcement replaced by something warmer and far more troubling. He told me the situation involved a jurisdictional dispute and suggested I find temporary accommodations while things were clarified legally. He never once asked Deborah to produce a single document, and he never once looked me directly in the eye. I got back in the truck and drove away. To anyone watching, it looked like I had lost the first round. Deborah was still standing on my porch as I pulled out, satisfied, settled, like someone watching an obstacle remove itself. She thought that was the end of it. Before I hit the main road, I called my real estate attorney in Denver. "I just got blocked from my own property," I said. "Start pulling everything on a woman named Deborah Caldwell and an organization called the Clearwater Conservation Committee." Then I hung up, and I started reading. 48 hours later, my phone was buzzing. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months were all sending me the same thing. A post spreading rapidly through an online community group called Protect Clearwater Nature, with over 4,200 members. Deborah had published a long, carefully composed entry. It included a photograph of me standing in front of the lodge. The image had been color-corrected to darken the sky. It was shot from a low angle that made me look imposing, like an intruder, not an owner. The caption described me as an out-of-state speculator attempting to seize our sacred forest land for commercial resort development. The comments came fast and hostile. People who had never met me, never seen a deed, never spoken a word with me, decided unanimously that I was the villain. "Get him out. Deborah has fought for us for years. We will not let this happen." I read every single one of them, and I responded to none of them. What I was doing instead was sitting with a topographical map of Clearwater County unfolded across the motel bed, a yellow legal pad beside it, and my laptop open. Because Deborah had written that she had spent 7 years protecting the forest. The lodge had only been vacant for 3. Those numbers didn't add up the way she wanted them to. I wrote that down. Then it escalated. A local radio station ran a 90-second interview in which Deborah's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine grief. She spoke about years of dedication, about a community's relationship with its land. She never stated a single factual falsehood. She was far too careful for that. Every sentence was a question, an implication, a loaded pause. I played the clip 3 times, not out of anger, because I was studying her technique. This was not amateur manipulation. This was practiced. Within a week, I had received a formal email from something called the Clearwater Residents Council, requesting my appearance at a community hearing. A reporter left a voicemail asking about my commercial plans. And my Denver attorney received a letter from a firm called Renner and Associates, suggesting that any property transaction involving the lodge was subject to community environmental review. None of these entities, not the Residents Council, not the Conservation Committee, not the Alliance, showed up in the Montana Secretary of State's business database as legally incorporated organizations. I spent 3 hours confirming that. They were names on letterhead, nothing more. But here's where it gets interesting. I opened the Montana Secretary of State's registry and entered 2 words: Caldwell, Clearwater. The result loaded in 4 seconds. Clearwater Natural Heritage Alliance, LLC. Registered 2019. Sole registered agent, Deborah Ann Caldwell. Registered address, the street address of my lodge. My lodge had been listed as the official business headquarters of her organization for 5 years, without my knowledge, without the knowledge of any previous owner. Deborah hadn't just taken my door, she had been living inside my paper trail for years. I rented a plain gray pickup, no Denver plates, and drove in from the north along a forestry access road that connected to the back boundary of my property. I parked 2 miles in and walked. I had a telephoto camera, a handheld GPS unit, and a set of soil sample bags from a supply store in Missoula. I had pulled 3 years of satellite imagery from the USGS Earth Explorer database and identified a section of forest to the northeast where the canopy was thinning in a pattern that didn't match natural die-off or fire management. After 40 minutes of walking, I found the road. 4 meters wide, compacted with gravel and crushed stone, running in a nearly straight line beneath the canopy. The edges had begun to revegetate, but the surface was still firm, and the drainage was engineered. This was not a hiking trail. This was a haul road, built to carry weight, built to last, and built specifically to avoid being visible from any public access point. I photographed everything, logged every GPS coordinate, bagged soil samples from 3 locations along the route. Then I noticed the smell. Faint, but unmistakable. Something chemical underneath the pine and damp earth. Not petroleum. Something sharper. I couldn't name it on the spot. I flagged the location and bagged additional soil. On the way back, I stopped at a local hardware supply store and had a casual conversation with a young man named Marcus at the register. I asked about recent bulk orders in the area, the kind of general contractor small talk that doesn't raise flags. He mentioned that a conservation organization had been placing regular orders for months. Gravel by the pallet, structural aggregate, drainage piping. He named the organization without me prompting him. He printed 3 months of receipts and handed them over with a staple through the corner. I sat in the parking lot and looked at those invoices for a long time. Road building materials, purchased with conservation grant funds, used to construct a private haul road through protected federal forest. The outline was becoming impossible to mistake. That's when they started watching me back. I came out one morning to find the front right tire of my rental truck completely flat, not slowly leaking, a clean, straight cut in the sidewall, 2 inches long, made with something sharp and intentional. That evening, my driver's side mirror had been folded inward. It takes a deliberate hand movement to fold those mirrors on that model. Someone had walked up to my truck in a motel parking lot in the middle of the afternoon and touched it, calmly, without concern about being seen. 2 hours later, a text arrived from an unknown number. "You should go back to Denver. This forest doesn't treat outsiders well." I screenshotted it, logged the timestamp, and kept moving. I drove to the nearest Best Buy, 2 hours away, and bought 4 compact wireless cameras with solar battery packs and cloud storage, a magnetic GPS tracker, and a high-quality handheld audio recorder. I paid in cash. That night, working in the dark outside my property boundary, I positioned all 4 cameras at angles covering the entrance, the northwest corner, the driveway approach, and the front parking area. The GPS tracker went under the frame rail of Deborah's moss green SUV while it sat unattended. Then I waited. On the 3rd night at 3:47 in the morning, a large commercial timber truck, no visible front license plate, moving slowly without full headlights, came down the approach from the northeast. It pulled into the lodge's front drive and stopped. Deborah came out through the front door within 2 minutes, which told me she had been awake and waiting. 2 other figures emerged from the tree line on foot. There was an exchange near the tailgate. After 25 minutes, the truck reversed back toward the Hall Road and disappeared. The audio recorder near the perimeter fence caught fragments of Deborah's phone call immediately after. Next shipment before Friday. The Alliance account is ready. I watched that footage 6 times in a row, not because I missed anything, because I needed to be certain of exactly what I was seeing before I said a single word to anyone. The soil sample results came back from an independent laboratory in Missoula. The report identified elevated concentrations of imazapyr, a broad-spectrum herbicide used in commercial forestry to suppress competing vegetation after a harvest. In open timber country, it's a standard tool. In a federally designated conservation zone, it is explicitly prohibited. They weren't just cutting the trees, they were chemically preventing the forest from growing back. I opened usaspending.gov, the federal government's public database tracking every dollar of grant expenditure, and searched the Alliance's name. 3 grants loaded. $110,000 from the Department of the Interior, 2020. $90,000 from the EPA, 2021. $140,000 from Interior again, 2023. Total, $340,000 of federal conservation funding, all directed toward protecting the very forest that the satellite imagery showed being systematically dismantled. I called the Inspector General's hotline for the Department of the Interior that afternoon. I was transferred twice before reaching a senior agent, Special Agent Rachel Huang, FBI Field Office Helena, specializing in environmental fraud and federal grant abuse. I walked her through everything: dates, dollar amounts, GPS coordinates, the satellite comparison, the lab results, the hardware invoices, the camera footage. She listened without interrupting for nearly 8 minutes. Then a 4-second pause. "Mr. Collins," she said, "I need you to preserve everything exactly as it is and discuss this with no one. That includes your local attorney." I understood what she meant without asking her to clarify. Sergeant Pruitt's name was already written on my legal pad, circled twice. For the next 3 weeks, I went almost completely silent. No public statements, no interviews, no community hearings. To the outside world, I looked exhausted, stalled, like a man reconsidering whether the lodge was worth the fight. That was exactly the impression I needed Deborah Caldwell to have. While I maintained that stillness, Agent Huang's team was conducting a forensic audit of the Alliance's financial records. Of the $340,000 in federal grant money deposited into the Alliance's operating account, $210,000 had been dispersed outward through 7 separate invoices, all labeled as environmental consulting fees, paid to a set of LLCs that shared no physical address, no employee records, and no operational history. Every single one of those LLCs traced back to accounts Deborah controlled directly. U.S. Forest Service agents independently confirmed that 340 mature ponderosa pine and western larch trees had been harvested from federal land without any permit. Estimated value at current timber market rates, approximately $180,000. Combined with the siphoned grant funds, the financial exposure exceeded $500,000. Before the chemical treatment damage was even factored in. Then Deborah made her fatal mistake. Feeling her cash flow tighten without understanding why, she fabricated a document, a formal emergency conservation management agreement bearing what purported to be the signature and seal of the Bureau of Land Management's Clearwater Field Office. She took it to a regional bank and applied for an $80,000 commercial loan. The bank's compliance officer recognized the BLM seal formatting as inconsistent with current federal document standards. They contacted the FBI within the hour. The loan never processed. Instead, it became Exhibit 14 in a federal case that was now building toward a charging document. Every move she made to stabilize her position added a new count to the stack. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning through the community group's email list. An emergency public forum. Saturday evening. Ridgefield Community Hall. Item 3 on the agenda read, Property owner Scott Collins will present his development intentions to the community for open review. It was framed as an invitation. It was structured as a trap. I accepted by return email within 20 minutes. I called Agent Huang that afternoon. She's organizing a public meeting Saturday. She'll have her full documentation on display. A brief pause on her end. We've been anticipating something like this. We'll be positioned accordingly. I arrived at Ridgefield Community Hall alone. No attorney, no support. Just a single manila folder, thin and unremarkable. I sat in the third row and didn't speak to anyone. Deborah took the stage at 7:07. Green Alliance jacket, silver hair set precisely. The gravity of someone who had rehearsed moral authority until it felt like a natural posture. She thanked the community for showing up to defend what belongs to all of us. The applause came immediately. Then she began presenting the binder. 47 pages, printed and bound professionally, projected onto a screen behind her. The first section was the Alliance's conservation history. Photographs, letters from county officials, images of the forest she claimed to have protected. Then she reached the third section, the section she had built to establish her legal standing as the legitimate steward of the lodge. She advanced to page 23 and let it fill the screen. It was a contract. At the top, in clear print, Pacific Northwest Timber Partners, LLC. Below that, the terms of a timber harvesting agreement covering the northeast corridor of the Clearwater Forest, signed by Deborah Caldwell on behalf of the Alliance, dated spring 2022, valued at $220,000. The room went quiet in a way rooms rarely do. A man in the third row, perhaps 60, the build of someone who had worked outside his whole life, raised his hand. You've spent this whole presentation telling us you're protecting the forest. That contract on the screen is a timber sale agreement. A second voice came from the left, a retired Forest Service worker who recognized Pacific Northwest Timber Partners and knew they held no valid extraction permit in Clearwater County. The murmur shifted register. I stood up. I waited until I had Deborah's eyes. And then I said with complete evenness, Page 31. Show them page 31. Her hand hesitated over the laptop. Then, perhaps because she hadn't prepared for that specific instruction and couldn't process its implication fast enough, she advanced the slide. Page 31 appeared on the screen. A bank transfer record. $47,000 from the Alliance operating account to a personal account registered in Deborah Caldwell's name. Memo line, management consulting fee. Her mouth opened. For the first time in this entire story, she had no prepared line to deliver. The doors at the back of Ridgefield Community Hall opened at 7:43 in the evening. I heard them before I turned to look. The particular sound of multiple people moving together with coordinated purpose. Special Agent Rachel Huang walked in first, badge held open at chest level, followed by 3 other federal agents and 2 IRS Criminal Investigation Division officers in civilian dress. The room turned. 200 heads swiveled in a single slow wave as people realized the event they had come to witness was not the event actually taking place. Huang walked the full length of the center aisle and stepped up to the front of the room. She didn't take the podium. She stood beside it, held her credentials where the room could see them, and said, "My name is Special Agent Rachel Huang, FBI Field Office Helena. Miss Caldwell, I need you to remain exactly where you are." Then she read the charges. Federal grant fraud, $340,000 misappropriated from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Unauthorized harvesting of federal forest resources. Falsification of federal documents. Bank fraud. Money laundering. Maximum combined sentencing exposure. 45 years in federal custody. Financial penalties up to $1.75 million. Deborah turned toward the audience, her audience, the 4,000 people she had spent years cultivating, and said with something that still carried the ghost of its former authority, "I have given 7 years to protecting this land. Everything I did was for this community." Huang waited for her to finish, then responded without inflection. "The documentation you presented on that screen tonight constitutes the central evidentiary exhibit in this case. We appreciate you making it available in a witnessed public setting." The handcuffs closed behind Deborah Caldwell's wrists at 7:51 p.m. She was walked out through the back door, past 200 people who had come to watch someone else be humiliated, and instead watch the woman they trusted face the consequence of what she had actually been doing in their name. The following morning, I drove up the dirt road alone. No moss-green SUV across the entrance. No drill sounds in the morning fog. I parked in front of my own door, took out my key, my lock installed by my locksmith, and turned it. The door opened into a space that smelled of old wood and cold air, and the particular silence of a building that had been waiting a long time for the right person to walk in. Through the east-facing window, past the tree line at the edge of the property, I could make out the fluorescent vests of a federal ecological restoration crew that had begun replanting the northeast corridor 3 days earlier. Small figures in the distance moving between the stumps carrying seedlings. The forest had been harvested. It was being returned. I stepped inside. The door swung closed behind me. For the first time in this entire story, there was nothing left to document. There is a version of this story where Scott Collins drives back to Denver after that first morning, bitter, defeated, convinced the system was too broken to bother with. Nobody would have blamed him. He didn't. And the reason has nothing to do with luck. It comes down to 4 things anyone can apply. 1. Anger is a luxury. Documentation is an asset. Every minute spent defending yourself in a space your opponent controls is a minute they use to consolidate their position. A time-stamped photograph, a GPS coordinate, a lab result. These don't win arguments, they win cases. 2. Know which door to knock on. Don't waste energy on a compromised local officer or a crowd that's already made up its mind. Identify the level at which your problem actually exists and deliver your evidence there, without detour. 3. Silence is a weapon. The people who abuse power are almost always undone by the quiet they cannot tolerate. They fill it. They cannot stop themselves. What Deborah read as paralysis was actually 3 weeks of a forensic audit running on every account she held. 4. Arrogance is always its own witness. Deborah didn't fall because Scott was smarter. She fell because she was so certain of her ability to control the narrative that she walked into a public room and projected her own signed evidence onto a screen, in front of 200 witnesses and 4 federal agents. Document everything. Find the right agency. Stay quiet with intention. And trust that people who build their power on deception are always one public presentation away from presenting it themselves.